Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. This webinar is a presentation of the State Federal RPS Collaborative, which is a project of the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA. And our topic for today's webinar is Renewable Portfolio Standards, Overview of Status and Key Trends. And we have an excellent guest speaker with us today who will be presenting on that topic. And our host for this webinar is Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of CESA, and he manages the RPS Collaborative. And before I pass it over to him, I would like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our guest speakers today are in, all of our participants today are in listen-only mode, so that means that you can hear us, hopefully, but we can't hear you. You have a couple of options to connect to the audio portion of this webinar. You can use a telephone or your computer mic and speakers, and there's some instructions that you'll see on your screen for that. Very importantly, we would like to encourage everyone to submit your questions as you think of them throughout the webinar. Submit them at any time by just typing them into the question box on your webinar console and hit send. And we will be reading through your questions as they come in, and we will facilitate a Q&A at the end of our presentation. So do type in your questions as you think of them. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. You will find a recording of this webinar as well as all of our previous webinars on our website at cesa.org/webinars. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to our host, Warren Leon. Warren?
Hey, thanks very much, Samantha. So CESA is a national nonprofit organization. We're a coalition of public agencies and organizations that are working together to advance clean energy. And you can see most of our members' logos up here on the website. And if we could go to the next slide. And one of the things we do is we coordinate the State Federal RPS Collaborative. We do that for the Department of Energy, and we do it with funding from the Energy Foundation. And the RPS Collaborative includes state RPS administrators, federal agency representatives, industry representatives, service providers, basically anybody who is interested in renewable portfolio standards and cares about RPS trends and developments. And we do a lot to advance dialogue and learning about RPS programs. If you're not on our mailing list, you can get a free monthly newsletter which tells you what's going on in the wonderful world of RPSs. It announces upcoming events like future webinars. So go to the website, CESA.org, to sign up for the newsletter if you're not on the list. And if we can go to the next slide. For a number of years, Sam, if you could, there we go. For a number of years, Galen, Barbose, and his colleagues at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab have been monitoring and following RPS trends and developments. They've put together some excellent summary slides and tables about what's going on, how things have changed over time. And it's very well known among folks who follow RPSs that the best overview introduction to where RPSs have been and where they're heading is a presentation by Galen on this topic, and that's what we're going to have today. Galen is, as it says there, a research scientist in the Electricity Markets and Policy Group at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. He's been there for 14 years conducting research on a wide range of issues related to the energy and electricity industry, focusing especially on renewable energy, energy efficiency, and electric system planning. With that, let me turn it over to Galen. He's going to speak for about half hour, maybe 35 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for your questions. So type them in. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Warren, and thanks to all of you for being here today. So this presentation that I'm going to give is, as Warren mentioned, something that I deliver on several occasions throughout the year, including at the RPS Summit that the RPS Collaborative hosts each year. And the material that I'll provide is stuff that we kind of track and update on an ongoing basis, and I'll provide you at the end of the presentation a website where you can find this presentation, earlier versions of this presentation, and all sorts of other materials related to our work tracking and analyzing state RPS programs. But this presentation today is really going to be a fairly kind of broad overview of a variety of trends related to RPS program experience to date. So the topics I'm going to cover are shown on the slide here as soon as it advances. Let's see. There we go. So I'm going to cover a number of different topics here today. I'll start out just providing a bit of background on the evolution of state RPS programs. I'll talk then about some of the impacts that these policies have had on renewable development historically, and also going forward, how much additional renewables might be needed in order to meet growing RPS demand. I'll talk a bit about compliance to date with RPS targets and compliance costs, and then we'll end just with some basic kind of summary points and a few kind of high-level points about what lies ahead. So many of you have no doubt seen versions of this map before, just showing which states in the U.S. currently have RPS policies. So as it stands today, there are 29 states plus the District of Columbia with some kind of mandatory RPS, and those 30 programs collectively apply to a little over half, 54% of total U.S. retail electricity sales. Now, these 30 policies have been enacted largely over about a 2-decade time span. That's what's shown above the timeline in the figure here. And you can see there was a large contingent of states that adopted RPS programs in the kind of mid to late 1990s, often as part of broader electric industry restructuring at the time. And then there was another large group of states that enacted programs in kind of the mid to late 2000s. There was then quite a significant lull following Kansas's RPS adopted in 2009, where we didn't see any new state RPS programs enacted. That lull ended last year when Vermont joined the club and developed a new mandatory RPS program that essentially replaced what was previously a voluntary non-binding target. Now, even though there was that lull, certainly not all has been quiet on the RPS front, and as we show below the timeline, in each year, many states, or at least in all cases, at least a handful of states, have undertaken some kind of significant major revision to their RPS program, typically via legislative action. And so you can see in 2015 there were 4 states that we've kind of deemed to have undertaken some major revision, and of course many other states that made somewhat less significant tweaks to their RPS. Now, in terms of the kinds of revisions that have been made, we can see a few general trends. One trend that was especially common maybe up to about a few years ago is we saw many states adopting resource-specific carve-outs or set-asides within their RPS. So the most common variant of this, which I'll be talking about further in this presentation, are solar or in some cases distributed generation carve-outs. So that was very common, and currently there are about, I believe, 17 or 18 states that have some sort of solar or DG carve-out within their RPS. Another common trend has been to increase or extend the RPS targets. We saw 2 examples of that in the last year, where both California and Hawaii both increased and extended out in time their RPS schedule. A third trend has been, we've seen many states, especially restructured states, develop requirements or ancillary programs that help to support long-term contracting for new renewables and thereby improve their financeability. Fourth, we've seen quite a few examples of states refining the eligibility rules surrounding what kinds of resources can be used to meet their RPS. And this has been particularly common for hydro and biomass resources, where often the eligibility rules have quite a few more sort of dimensions and specifics to them than they do for, say, wind and solar. And then last on this list, we've seen many proposals to repeal, reduce, or freeze existing RPS programs. Very few of those proposals have actually been enacted. There really have only been one state, Kansas, that actually repealed its RPS, and then Ohio enacted a temporary 2-year freeze on its RPS. We've seen many other states where these kinds of proposals have been put forth, but thus far, really only those two have actually moved into law. So with that, let me now move to kind of the second section of this talk, and I'll speak a little bit about how RPS programs have affected renewable development in the U.S. thus far. Now, I think it's useful to begin by just noting that to really parse out the impacts of RPS programs on renewable development is a difficult, if not perhaps impossible task. And that's the case simply because there are so many other factors, policies, and underlying market drivers that are also supporting the development of renewable energy in the U.S. And so what I'm going to show you here is really not an attempt to isolate the effects of RPS programs, but really rather just kind of a rough way of gauging kind of the relative size of the potential impacts. And there are a couple of different ways of doing this. One way is, and this is what we show in the figure on the left-hand side, is by comparing the total growth in U.S. renewable electricity generation, that's the red line, to the amount of growth, the minimum amount of growth that would have needed to occur just to meet RPS requirements. And you can see in that comparison that the two have, although they haven't tracked each other perfectly, that there is clearly a correspondence. And looking at the year 2015, about 65%, so roughly 2/3 of all the increase in renewable electricity generation is essentially the amount that would have needed to have happened just to meet those RPS programs. So you can think about, that as being sort of the minimum contribution from RPS programs, just kind of ignoring all of the other factors at play. Now, there's another way that we can look at this, and that's based on renewable capacity additions, and that's what the figure on the right-hand side shows. And looking at kind of the top line, you can see that about 110 gigawatts of renewable generation capacity is currently installed in the U.S. That's the total installed base of non-hydro renewable generating capacity today. And we can look at the individual projects that make up that 110 gigawatts and kind of roughly ascribe those individual projects to RPS programs based on what utility or entity is receiving electricity and RECs from those projects. And based on that, that kind of bean counting exercise, we end up with a tally of about 56%, so a little over half of all of the installed base of renewable capacity is under contract just to an entity with RPS obligations and therefore at least available for RPS compliance if not being currently used for it. Now, drilling down a little bit deeper into just that RPS-driven or RPS-motivated renewable generating capacity, what we show in the figure on the left-hand side here is annual RPS capacity additions broken out into those 4 different technology types shown. And the basic trend here is that at least historically, cumulatively, the most common resource to have been supported through RPS programs has been wind energy. That's what the pie chart on the right-hand side shows. About 65% of all RPS-driven renewable capacity has been wind. But looking at the figure on the left, you can see that really solar has taken on a growing share of that new RPS build. And over the last 3 years in particular, solar has really been the predominant source of new RPS-driven capacity. And that trend reflects kind of 2 basic underlying drivers. The first is the proliferation of solar and distributed generation set-asides, which, as I mentioned, currently exist in a little over half of all RPS states. And then the other underlying trend is just the declining cost and increasing economic competitiveness of solar relative to wind. And because of that, we've seen growing amounts of solar, largely utility-scale solar in the Southwest, being used to meet general RPS obligations. And we can see on the next slide both of those 2 underlying trends. And so what we show in the figure on the left here is just the total U.S. solar capacity additions broken out into 3 different buckets. So the bucket on the top is just the non-RPS solar. So this is solar capacity added each year that is really happening completely outside of any RPS market or requirement. The middle bar shows just the solar capacity that's being added each year and is being used to meet solar or DG set-asides or carve-outs. And that amount has been somewhat stable over time. And its distribution among states is shown in the pie chart on the right, where you can see New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Arizona being kind of the 3 largest states within that middle bar segment, but then many others making up the remainder. And then that bottom darkest bar segment in the left-hand figure is, as I mentioned, solar that's being added each year and is being used to meet general RPS obligations. And as the pie chart on the bottom right shows, the lion's share of that, a little over half, is located in California and is being used to meet California's RPS obligations. There are some other big southwestern states there, Arizona and Nevada, where solar is being added both to meet the RPS obligations in those states, as well, in some cases, is being imported into California in order to meet California's RPS. And then you can also see North Carolina and Hawaii among the states where significant amounts of solar is being added to meet general RPS obligations. So that's kind of looking to the past. Let's turn our perspective to the future and look at what is going to happen to RPS demand going forward and what that increasing RPS demand means in terms of incremental needs for additional renewable capacity above and beyond what's currently in the ground. So it's useful to just start by reminding ourselves that in all cases, or at least all but one case, RPS programs, they have kind of a finite trajectory, right? They are typically specified as a percentage of retail sales, and that percentage requirement ramps up over time to a specific point at a specific year in the future. And what we've shown here is the kind of final year, or the zenith, as at least one person I know has referred to it, of each state's RPS target. So this is the year when the percentage reaches its maximum value. And you can see here that there have been a few states that actually reached that final percentage target last year. and a good handful that will then meet it throughout the remainder of this decade through 2020, and then a large contingent that won't meet their final target out into 2025 or beyond. But the bottom line is that although states certainly are bearing down on those final targets, most do still have at least 5 to 10 years of growth in RPS demand. And so that's important to keep in mind when we move to the next figure, which shows how RPS demand in aggregate will rise over time. So the blue line on the bottom of this figure just rolls up all 30 RPS programs and shows how much is required in each year as a percentage of total U.S. retail electricity sales. So you can see that in 2015, RPS programs collectively required an amount of renewable generation equal to about 5.3% of all U.S. retail electricity sales, and that percentage rises to 9.6% in 2030. So just under a doubling in terms of RPS demand. The biggest share, or at least the plurality of that increase, is in California. So California just this last year increased its RPS from 33% by 2020 to 50% by 2030. And so that additional incremental demand is a big part of that overall aggregate U.S. increase in RPS demand that we see here. Now, you can compare that to total U.S. renewable energy supply, and that's what the red line shows. And we can just sort of hypothetically extend current U.S. retail renewable energy generation out to 2030 under kind of the hypothetical that, what would happen if renewable generation just simply kept pace with the increase in RPS demand. And if that were to happen, then we'd be looking at renewable generation equal to about 12.1% of total U.S. retail electricity sales out in 2030. Now, of course, there's a delta you can see in 2015 between RPS demand and total U.S. renewable energy supplies. And part of that delta is renewable electricity that RPS entities have over-procured above and beyond what their 2015 requirements were. So they're kind of procuring in advance, recognizing that their requirements will increase over time. And in addition, there's a pretty robust and significant voluntary green power market in the U.S., and that really represents actually the bulk of that delta, that 2015 delta that we see. And some of that surplus that exists today, of course, could be used to meet future RPS demand growth. And so that's what this next slide is going to drill down into a little bit more. Instead, though, we're going to look at this in terms of renewable generation capacity. It's just, for a variety of reasons, a little bit easier to track megawatts than megawatt hours. And what we've done here is we've tried to estimate how much residual demand for new renewable capacity exists above and beyond what's currently in the ground today. And we do this based on looking at current renewable electricity supplies and where those resources, those megawatts, are being sold and contracted to. And based on that analysis, we estimate that about 28 gigawatts of additional renewable capacity will be needed by 2020 in order to meet growing RPS demand, and about 63 gigawatts by 2030. And just to put that into context, to date, about 56 gigawatts of new renewable capacity has been brought online in order to meet RPS programs. That was what we saw a few figures ago, where we showed the overall growth in renewable capacity in the U.S. over time. So essentially what we're talking about is a little bit more than a doubling. In other words, RPS programs collectively are about halfway on the path towards what they ultimately will require in terms of renewable generating capacity. Now, to be sure, some of that residual RPS demand may be met with renewable capacity that's already under development, and that's what the red horizontal bars in this figure show. Currently, there's about 28 gigawatts of renewable capacity that's under development in the U.S. Certainly, not all of it will be built, and not all of it will necessarily be available for RPS compliance. But nevertheless, you can see, for example, in the western U.S., just that renewable capacity that's currently under development would be enough to fully meet all of the residual RPS needs through 2020, and then the incremental needs beyond that would then require some additional amount of renewables beyond what's currently in the pipeline. The next slide here just more or less kind of shows the same thing, but focusing specifically on solar set-asides or solar carve-outs. Now, looking at the demand associated with these carve-outs, they will require upwards of about 9 gigawatts of total solar capacity by 2030, just to meet the set-asides. And that's relative to 4 gigawatts required today. Now, a number of states, many in fact, are currently oversupplied relative to their solar carve-out targets today, and there are a number of states, a few that have actually already met their final carve-out targets in the final RPS year. Nevertheless, there still is a fairly sizable amount of remaining residual carve-out demand. We estimate that about 2 to 3 gigawatts of additional solar will be needed in order to meet set-aside requirements in 2020, and about 4 gigawatts of additional solar capacity will be needed by 2030. And you can see how that's distributed among the states in the figure here, where, for example, Massachusetts, Maryland, Minnesota, and New Jersey are the 4 states where really most of the near-term residual solar set-aside demand lies. So we're going to turn now to talking just very quickly about compliance with RPS programs. One of the key functions in administration of RPS programs is, of course, to evaluate and enforce compliance with these targets. And so we've collected quite a bit of data from utility and PUC compliance filings in order to kind of characterize how well states have met their RPS obligations thus far. And what we show here is the percentage of each state's RPS that was fulfilled with either renewable electricity or renewable electricity certificates in each year. So a value of 100% means that the target was fully achieved. And what you can see is that most states in most years have fully met their RPS targets, at least over the 3-year period that we're focusing on in the figure here. There have been a few exceptions, though, and you can see in particular in the Northeast there has been compliance below 100% in a few instances, and that just reflects the fact that that region has historically been somewhat short on renewable supplies relative to its RPS demand, and that's reflected in the compliance numbers here. This next slide shows essentially the same thing, but focusing just on solar and DG carve-outs. The array of icons is not quite as tidy on the last slide, but nevertheless you can see that in most cases compliance has been close to 100%, though clearly there are exceptions to that, and in each case it's really for sort of some sort of state-specific set of conditions, but nevertheless pretty high levels of compliance with solar set-asides in most states. So now, really for the last kind of substantive portion of the talk, I'd like to turn to RPS compliance costs. And this is a topic that has received a fair amount of attention. Certainly, many of the discussions and proposals to scale back RPS requirements have been rooted if not explicitly, at least kind of tacitly, in concerns about RPS costs and the impacts of RPS requirements on consumer rates and bills. And so what we've done here is we've really tried to look at this question empirically, even if somewhat imperfectly, in order to kind of bring the data to bear on this question of how significant these costs have been. Now, I want to just start out with a little bit of background on what we mean by compliance costs and how we've gone about estimating these costs. So for the purpose of the analysis here, really we're focusing on the net cost to the utility or the other load-serving entity with compliance obligations, and these are net costs above and beyond what would have been incurred in the absence of the RPS. By focusing on the utility or the load-serving entities, we're of course ignoring a whole host of broader societal benefits that may occur outside the boundary of the individual utility. And we actually just put out a study a few weeks ago that tries to kind of fill in those gaps and that estimates some of those broader societal benefits and impacts. But for the purpose of the presentation here, I'm really just going to focus on the net compliance costs to the utility. And the important point to note here is that our approach really differs between restructured markets and more traditionally regulated markets. For restructured markets, compliance with RPS programs typically consists of purchase and retirement of unbundled renewable energy certificates. And so our approach here has really just been to estimate the total cost of all REC purchases plus any expenditures on alternative compliance payments. And so the numbers that I'll show for restructured markets are really just based on these REC and ACP costs. For regulated markets, it's a little bit more complicated. In those states, compliance with the RPS typically involves bundled power purchase agreements where the incremental cost of the renewable generation is not directly observable, and so it has to be imputed by comparison to some kind of counterfactual, some set of assumptions about what the utility would have purchased in the absence of the RPS. And so for these states, we actually didn't ourselves perform those independent counterfactual analyses, but rather relied on estimates that utilities and PUCs in those states have developed and typically develop on an annual basis as part of their kind of routine compliance reporting processes. And so for regulated markets, what we'll be showing you is really just kind of a compilation of utility and state-specific estimates that each rely on different kinds of methodologies and assumptions. And so there is certainly kind of an irreducible apples to oranges element in the comparisons for those regulated states. And I'll reiterate that point again, most likely when we get to those results. So I'm going to focus first on the restructured markets, where again we're relying on REC prices, and the figures here show spot market REC prices and help to illustrate a couple kind of basic underlying dynamics here. And really the key point to note is that REC pricing, at least in the short run, reflects the balance between supply and demand for renewable energy certificates in any given market. And for what we've shown here are Class 1 or Tier 1 RECs. And for that class of RECs, really these are regional markets. And so that's why we've segmented the data into these two regions shown here. And what you can see in the figure on the left, which shows New England Class 1 RECs, is that those prices have been relatively high, up in the kind of $50 to $60 per megawatt hour price range for the past few years. And that's more or less the price of the ACP in those markets. And so that's indicative of markets that are short or where there's a tight balance between supply and demand. In the right-hand side, we show spot market rec prices for Mid-Atlantic market, and the story there is almost the converse, where you can see, at least historically, those prices have been very low, reflecting an oversupply, though in the past few years those prices have come up a little bit, kind of hovering in the $15 per megawatt hour range. The next slide here just shows solar renewable energy certificate prices. So these are the compliance instruments that are used to meet solar carve-outs. And these are, unlike the Class 1 RECs, which we were looking at on the previous slide, these markets are really state-specific in most cases, because most states, in effect, require that solar resources be located in-state in order to meet their set-aside requirement. I'm not going to talk at all about the specifics of individual states here, other than just to note that you can see quite a wide range in SREC prices, ranging from, at the high end, close to $500 per megawatt hour in DC and Massachusetts, and less than $50 a megawatt hour in a number of other states. And that, again, really just kind of reflects the balance of supply and demand in those states. Now, from the perspective of kind of understanding what the effects are on retail consumers and customer bills, those REC pricing slides are maybe a little bit hard to contextualize. And so what we've done here is we've taken those REC prices and we've estimated what the REC costs and the ACP costs amount to as a percentage of average customer bill. And so you can kind of think about this as being the sort of a hypothetical rate impact if those REC and ACP costs were fully and immediately passed through to consumers. And so that's what the percentages on the y-axis show. And you can see here across, and these again are just the restructured states, that in most years and in most states, these REC and ACP costs have amounted to less than 3% of average retail rates or retail bills. And across the full set of states, they range from as low as 0.1% to upwards of 5.6% of average retail rates just in the most recent year, in 2014. And those differences across states reflect all kind of, fairly predictable underlying factors. Of course, different states have different RPS target levels, and so all else being equal, you would expect higher RPS targets to entail higher RPS compliance costs. States also differ in terms of the underlying mix of resource tiers, whether they have solar set-asides, and the relative size of the different tiers compared to one another. And then the third one, which really kind of harkens back to the slides we were just looking at before, is that underlying REC and ACP prices vary quite considerably across states, reflecting, again, the differences in the balance of supply and demand across states. The other important kind of trend to note here is that, at least in some states, you can see a fairly obvious incline to compliance costs over time. And that incline has to do both with the fact that the targets themselves tend to increase over time, as well as that, at least in a number of markets and states, REC prices also were rising over this period. And so that's why you can see, for example, an incline in New Jersey, where Mid-Atlantic Class 1 RECs were increasing over that period of time. And this next slide here, and this is the last one on restructured markets, just focuses on the most recent year, which in most cases is 2014, and breaks out those compliance costs into the different resource tiers. And so you can see how much of the overall REC plus ACP cost is associated with the solar set-aside versus the main tier versus any secondary tier. And you can see in most states that The main tier represents the bulk of the overall compliance costs, though there are clearly a couple exceptions in DC and New Jersey where the solar set-aside is the bulk of the overall cost. And then interestingly in New Hampshire, their secondary tier 2 requirement actually represents about half of the overall cost of compliance. The next slide here, now we're turning to regulated markets. So again, our approach here really differed fundamentally from the other states that we were just looking at. For the regulated states, as I mentioned, we just compiled cost estimates that each utility or PUC in these states themselves developed, where they attempted to estimate the incremental cost of RPS resources relative to what would have been procured in the absence of the RPS, using whatever sort of assumptions and methodologies they happen to use in each state. And you can see here in the figure on the left-hand side where we've, again, shown these compliance costs as a percentage of average retail rates, that in most cases you're looking at aggregate compliance costs less than about 3% of average retail rates, though again a quite significant range across states. In some of those states that are at the upper end of that range, really the underlying driver there is that these are states with DG or solar set-asides, and often those set-asides are being fulfilled through rebate programs or performance-based incentive programs that provide the bulk of the overall payment up front. And so in effect, those states are they're basically paying up front for the entire stream of RECs that those resources will generate over their lifetime. And thus, in effect, the relatively high cost that we're seeing in those states is something of an accounting artifact, which I just mentioned it because it further underscores some of the methodological differences across these states. At the lower end of the spectrum, though, you can see many states with compliance costs far below zero, often because they simply had low RPS targets in these years or were relying primarily on pre-existing renewables that had essentially no incremental cost. You can also interestingly see a few states, California, Hawaii, and Oregon, that had negative compliance costs, which indicate that the RPS was deemed to result in net savings for utilities and their customers in those years. So again, just very wide range, but bottom line, we're in most cases looking at compliance costs less than 3% of average rates. The next slide here, which is really the last of the data slides before I just wrap things up. So now, the compliance costs that we were looking at on the previous set of slides, that was all historical data, really focusing on years through 2014. Going forward, of course, RPS targets will continue to increase, and all else being equal, those increases in RPS targets will tend to put upward pressure on compliance costs. Now, most states have adopted some kind of cost cap or other cost containment mechanism as a safety valve in order to prevent compliance costs from exceeding some level that was deemed acceptable at the time. And those those cost containment mechanisms come in many different forms and shapes. What we've tried to do here is translate each of those compliance cost mechanisms cost containment mechanisms into the equivalent maximum percentage increase in average retail rate. So that's what the red bars show. So those red bars in the figure show kind of in the most extreme conditions what is the maximum allowable increase in average retail rates as a result of the RPS. Looking on the left-hand side, we just show those states where the alternative compliance payment mechanism is the primary cost containment mechanism. And so for those states, the red bars essentially assume that in the final year, when the RPS target reaches its maximum, what would the rate impact be if 100% of the obligation in that year was met with ACPs or with RECs that were at the ACP level. And you can see for those states, in most cases, you're looking at rate impacts in the kind of 6 to 9%, 5 to 10% kind of range. And the green bars just show actual historic compliance costs for the most recent year, in most cases 2014, and that gives you some sense of the headroom that exists between now and kind of the ultimate cost cap. Now on the right-hand side, we have all of the states that rely on some other type of cost containment mechanism. In many cases, in fact, these are explicit rate impact caps that prohibit utilities from procuring renewables beyond a level that would cause rates to rise above some threshold percentage value. And you can see that in these states, the cost caps are much lower, typically in the kind of the 1 to 4% of average retail rate ranges. And many of these states are already starting to bump up against those cost caps. And that has implications going forward. If states start to hit those caps, then essentially that really can require curtailment of any further procurement under the RPS program. And I'll come back to that on the last slide here, where I just give some sort of forward-looking thoughts. Actually, this slide here, this is really just sort of a summary cheat sheet of kind of the key factoids and takeaways from the material that I've presented thus far. I won't go over this, but this is maybe just sort of a useful reference slide if you want to see kind of summary points from the preceding graphics. The last slide here, though, that I'll really talk about is this one, where I've just tried to identify, looking forward, what are some of the big picture issues that will really drive the impact and the role of state RPS programs going forward. And we've distinguished perhaps in a more complicated manner than we need to between endogenous or kind of internal factors that are internal to the operation of RPS programs, and then exogenous or external factors. And so among those endogenous factors, the first one, of course, is the continuing kind of volley of legislative and legal challenges to state RPS programs. We've seen many of these proposals over the past few years, and it would seem that they'll continue to be issued going forward, and so certainly the outcome of those legal and legislative challenges will be important. The second issue is one that I mentioned just on the last slide, whether and when compliance cost caps become binding, and if so, how PUCs respond. And then the last of those endogenous factors is simply whether and how RPS program administrators and legislatures decide to retune and refine their RPS programs, either in response to experience with those programs or in response to external factors. And among those external factors, the first two listed here are perhaps the most significant. Obviously, all of you are no doubt aware of the Clean Power Plan and the potential for it to have quite significant implications for renewable energy development in the U.S. And although there are many questions about how exactly states will go about fulfilling their CPP requirements and what role RPS programs will play, there are clearly many possible interactions, and so one thing that we'll be keeping an eye on is how states decide to kind of leverage and refine their RPS programs in response to the CPP. The second kind of big external factor, and maybe this doesn't belong on the list anymore, but the federal tax credits, the ITC and the PTC, of course, were sort of had impending expirations for quite some time. They were just recently renewed, and we may expect that renewal to have implications for how states go about meeting their RPSs and the willingness of some states to potentially double down on their RPS commitments now that they know that those federal tax credits will be in place at least for another 5 years or so. And then the last item on this list is really just kind of a catch-all, recognizing that RPS programs don't exist in a vacuum, but rather exist in parallel to all sorts of other policies and issues affecting renewable energy deployment, things like integration and siting and net metering, and whether and how those issues are addressed certainly can have implications for RPS programs, and so we just kind of acknowledge the possibility of those many diverse interactions here. So with that, I just would like to thank you all for your attention. I've pointed out on this last slide a website that we've created. It's just sort of a clearinghouse for various presentations and data files and reports, all relating to RPS programs, so please feel free to check that out. And of course, if you have any questions for me that aren't addressed in the Q&A, feel free to send me an email. My contact information is listed here. So with that, Warren, I'll hand it over to you for the Q&A.
Well, Galen, that was certainly a whirlwind tour through a lot of information. You've covered a great deal of ground, and we've gone a bunch of different questions that I will ask. In part because of the number of questions, I want to let folks know we will probably run out over about 5 to 7 minutes on this webinar. But let me start with the first question. And that is, why did wind capacity drop so drastically after 2012?
Okay, yeah, so that I can perhaps, let's see if I can navigate my way back to, oh no, I don't think I have control anymore. Yeah, so there was a figure that we showed early on in the presentation that showed just the RPS-driven capacity additions each year. So it wasn't total U.S. renewable capacity additions, and that's an important distinction. But you did see in that figure that at least among the RPS capacity additions, wind energy shrunk considerably in its relative share, and that partly had to do with really kind of a multitude of different factors. Part of it was kind of the boom bust that has accompanied the periodic expiration or potential expiration of the PTC, and so that was, we saw in some of those years just nationally a big contraction in wind capacity additions, and so that's also reflected among the RPS capacity additions. Thank you. But then in addition, historically, a lot of the wind capacity in the U.S. has been installed in the Midwest and in Texas. And when we put together the graphic here, we tried to identify projects that were being used to meet RPS requirements. And in both Texas and in the Midwest, most of those RPS requirements became basically fully subscribed over this period. Certainly that was the case in Texas, and to some extent in the Midwest as well. And so even though wind capacity continued to be installed in those regions, for our purposes here, we really didn't count it as being RPS motivated because those RPS obligations were already kind of fully achieved. And so some of the decline here is just kind of a bit of an artifact of our counting conventions.
Good. Here's a question about what ends up being used to meet RPSs and what isn't counted or considered. And this person wants to know, how are municipal, off-grid, community solar, and Defense Department solar installations counted or not counted in RPS compliance?
Let's see. So community, off-grid, Department of Defense, what else?
And municipal. 4 different things.
And municipal. Okay, so I guess the first thing to note, of course, is that every state has really its own set of eligibility criteria, and so it can be a little bit hard to generalize, or at least one has to be careful about not overgeneralizing in response to questions of this variety. That being said, I think we can talk about at least a few of these particular categories. So off-grid renewables typically are not eligible for RPS programs. RPS programs are really aimed at increasing the supply of grid-delivered renewable electricity. And so off-grid stuff it just generally doesn't count. There may be some exceptions to that. I don't want to be totally definitive, but I can't think offhand of any cases where off-grid renewables would count. Community solar, it really depends on the state. In most cases, community solar, it really just depends where the RECs go. So if individuals are purchasing shares of a community solar project and as part of those purchases, they're receiving the RECs. They may decide to retain the RECs themselves or retire the RECs themselves as their own kind of voluntary commitment to supporting renewable energy. And in those cases, then those RECs are kind of taken out of the pool for RPS supplies and thus aren't really being used to meet RPS obligations. In other cases, there are community solar projects where the RECs are being stripped out and sold separately, and they may be getting sold separately into voluntary markets, or they may be getting sold into RPS compliance markets. So it really just depends on the specifics of the project, and whether the state in developing the enabling legislation for community solar has any specific requirements related to sort of how those RECs should be disposed. For Department of Defense and municipal customers, so municipal, I assume that the question about municipal has to do with municipal customers rather than municipal utilities.
Yes.
But for both Department of Defense and municipal customers, these are large customers that often are making renewable energy purchases out of their own kind of voluntary commitment, or in the case of Department of Defense, in order to meet federal mandates for federal facilities. And in those cases, generally, again, similar to kind of with community solar, those RECs, if they're being purchased, if the renewable energy and the RECs are being purchased in order to fulfill some voluntary obligations or federal obligations, they'd be taken out of the supply pool for RPSs and really wouldn't be getting counted there. But of course, there may be cases where those entities are selling the RECs to utilities or load-serving entities with RPS obligations. It's not necessarily prohibited, but I would say that's probably not the typical situation.
Good. And I have several questions having to do with New York. The first one had to do with, why compared to most other states had New York fallen significantly short of its target? And then looking forward towards the new RPS target that New York is putting in place of 50% in 2030, do you have any sense as to how ambitious that is and how difficult or easy it would be to achieve that sort of target?
Okay, well, I can definitely answer the first question. The second one I may have to hedge a little bit on, just because I can't say I've really looked in depth at New York's situation specifically, at least kind of on a perspective basis. But the first question had to do with why New York historically has had lower compliance, apparently lower compliance levels than other states. And New York is kind of an oddity, and it's difficult to include them in this figure. So New York is different from all of the other states shown there, with the exception of Illinois, in that rather than compliance obligations falling on individual utilities or load-serving entities, instead you have some central agency, in the case of New York it's NYSERDA, who's responsible for procuring all the RECs on behalf of the customers and the utilities in the state. And the way that NYSERDA really kind of gauges its own progress is based not on the amount of RECs delivered each year, but rather based on the number of RECs that are under contract in each year. And so when looked at using sort of the metrics that NYSERDA uses, they have very high compliance. It may be 100%, I don't recall, but they have, the amount of renewable energy or RECs that they have under contract is, of course, far greater than what's been delivered in any given year, and what's being delivered in any given year is what's shown here. And the reason why we kind of treat New York in this way is really just to kind of make it apples to apples with the other states, but in doing so, we kind of deviate from the way that New York itself internally gauges its own compliance. So I think that the short answer to this is that it's a little bit of just kind of putting a square peg into a round hole. That's kind of why New York shows up the way that it does in this figure. But if their compliance is being assessed using the metric that they've sort of established for themselves, rather than this kind of standardized metric that I've developed and employed across the board, then in that case, their compliance looks much higher and is kind of in line with the other states.
And then in terms of, you want to say anything about New York going forward?
Going forward, no. I mean, I think I probably have to pass on that just because I know it's, that discussion is ongoing, and I don't want to speculate when there are folks out there that really have a more informed basis for answering that question.
Okay, good. Well, I'm going to have one last question for you. Actually, it's a cluster of several questions that came in. But before I do that, I wanted to point out to folks on the call that Galen's presentation did not include much discussion about RPS benefits, and that in part is because Galen and his colleagues, along with colleagues at the National Renewable Energy Lab, just have come out with a major new report on RPS benefits, and you can find it on the LBL website, and you can find a link to a very good webinar on that topic, particularly about the RPS benefits and the best estimates of quantifying those benefits. So the last question I wanted to focus on had to do with the Clean Power Plan. And we're going to be coming out with a report soon on the relationship between RPSs and the Clean Power Plan, and we'll be having a webinar on that topic in the next couple of months. But several people have just asked if you could say generally, what are some of the implications of the Clean Power Plan for RPS targets? Do you think it's going to cause some states that don't have RPSs or have close to reach their maximum target add RPS targets or increase RPS targets? Do you think it's possible they'd add any special carve-outs or set-asides that would be especially linked to the Clean Power Plan? What do you want to say on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big area of discussion, and it's hard to sort of give a concise and fair answer. Certainly, I mean, I will just maybe reiterate the plug that you were giving, Warren, that Ed Holt has done some great work on this very topic, and I assume what you were referring to, Warren, was the paper that we'll be putting out soon, and the webinar that he and Todd Jones from Center for Resource Solutions did for you guys, I guess, a few weeks ago. And so those guys really, I think, have answered that question or that set of questions in the very best way that can be answered at this point in time, given just how many uncertainties there are. And I mean, there are uncertainties at the highest level in terms of the legal challenges to the Clean Power Plan and what, whether those ultimately will prevail or not. And even assuming they don't, and that the Clean Power Plan goes forward as is, there are just so many different ways in which states might go about meeting those CPP targets, and each of those different ways has different implications for renewable energy and for RPS programs. I think the short answer, though, is that in most cases, in most of the compliance pathways, RPS programs can help states meet their CPP obligation, even if it's in a somewhat indirect and supportive manner. And so I'm sure that states that have RPS programs will be looking at ways in which the RPS interacts with the CPP. And I think it's maybe just important, though, to note that it is not necessarily a foregone conclusion that states with an RPS will want to use their RPS to meet their CPP. And in fact, there could be examples of states that want the exact opposite. Namely, they may want their RPS to be fully incremental to the CPP and to achieve carbon reductions above and beyond what the CPP requires. And so whether that's sort of the policy objective and mindset of a state, or whether the objective instead is to leverage the RPS as fully as possible, I think the key thing is just for states to be first to understand the interactions between the two policies, and only once that is really understood can specific policy prescriptions start to be identified.
Hey, Galen, thanks so much for doing this webinar. You've given us a lot of great information, and you did a heroic job of going through so much of it in such a short time. The webinar, will be up on the CESA website. It'll also be up on the Lawrence Berkeley Lab website. You can find it there. And I hope all of you will listen to future RPS Collaborative webinars, including the one we're having next week on hydropower and RPSs. If you haven't signed up for that, I encourage you to do so. Thanks very much for attending today.
Thank you.